inquiries, I support applications, applicants, I assess applications, and I monitor our projects in London and in the southeast of England and the east of England. So it's quite a stretch of the country. I've been working in the heritage sector for about 25 years or more. And in that time, been involved in planning and developing a range of heritage projects, new museums, exhibitions, galleries, a Georgian mansion, a Victorian railway, and in the process, inevitably doing a fair bit of fundraising to get those off the ground, and managing them post-completion as well. I've also done a fair bit of work in the third sector and with a range of funders before I joined AHF. So I worked with the Henry Smith charity, various community foundations, and a way back the Heritage Fund as well when it was HLF, and we all found it much easier to say. So there's my contact details there. A lot of what I say today in terms of the work that we do, obviously you can find out more information on our website, or always feel free to get in contact with me if you want to talk anything through in a bit more detail. The Architectural Fund, a heritage fund itself, has been going for about 45 years. And we exist basically to promote the conservation and reuse of historic buildings, with a focus very much on bringing those into use for the benefit of communities. So that means that we are set up to help communities take ownership of old buildings, and then to help them through the process of repairing and adapting those for new uses. And we do this basically in three main ways, through the advice that we can provide, and that includes the ability to actually provide a help with applications, or for groups that are new to this or haven't got a background in heritage. We can, in some cases, commission consultants to get groups to the point where they are ready to apply. We provide loans, and we provide grants. And in the last year, we've given out about £11 million, of which just under 7 million was in grants. The bulk of that, about £10 million of that, has been in England, and a lot of it directed through our Transforming Places programme, which has a focus on high streets and town centres. I'll come on and talk a little bit more about the support that we can provide, and specifically our viability grants. But as I say, there's a lot more information about the work that we do and the support that we can provide on our website. Let me see if I can move to the next screen. Okay, so so my session today is focused on viability, the foundations of viability. So I'm basically going to cover three main areas. Firstly, what we mean by viability. Secondly, how you establish whether your project is viable, and then wrapping up with a little bit about our role in that, and how AHF can help you establish viability for your project. I'm going to be using a lot of slides, a lot of photographs of different projects as we go through, and what I'll try and do is kind of name check them if time allows, because they're all examples of projects that we have funded and that are at various stages in their journey. So just to start off then, in terms of what we mean by viability. And in essence, what we're talking about is whether a project will work. Can it be a success? And this is not just in the short term. We're talking about whether a project can work in the long term. So it's not just whether it's technically or physically feasible to work with a building, to convert a building and bring it back into use. But is it a viable, sustainable proposition? And I know this is something that Alex is going to come on to talk about later. But it is really making sure that you've covered the bases, that the foundations are strong, so that the project has every chance of being delivered. And that is really about identifying what the risks to that delivery might be, and managing them, being aware and managing what those risks are. And for those of you that attended the second workshop a couple of weeks ago, I know that Niall Phillips from Purcell was talking about options appraisals. And these terms are often used interchangeably. We often use them interchangeably because quite often people that are doing viability studies with our help are also looking at options for use of a building. But there is a distinction in the sense that an options appraisal will be looking at what different uses could be made of a building, and viability is actually sort of broader and wider than that. It's a sort of wider consideration of all the issues that need to be taken into account to answer the fundamental question of whether you and your partners and your funders should commit further cost and time and risk the energy basically to deliver a project. So does it stack up, and should it move forward? And there's a whole range of things to consider that will impact on whether your project is viable and sustainable. So that's what I'm going to be looking at and running through today. If I was going to sort of summarize these, I'd say that these are the core issues. These are sort of the headlines, really. So first of all, is it the right building? And there are a whole range of things that obviously flow from that. Is the building in the right location? Is it the right size? What condition is it in? Can you get your hands on it? Can it be repaired and adapted? I'm going to go through some of these in a bit more detail, but is it the right building is a fundamental question and obviously thing to establish. How can we use it? So do you have a strong vision? Does that vision meet a need that you can demonstrate? Is there a demand for what you're proposing to do? What will it cost? And how will you fund it, both in terms of the capital, the cost of the work that needs to be done to get the doors open, but also then critically how you'll sustain it as a business, when it's in operation and into the future. So even at the very early stages, it's got to have that long-term perspective. So there are, within those kind of headline issues, there are really a long list of things that need to be considered that may impact on whether your project is viable. So I'm going to go through some of these and break it down a little bit more. So starting with ownership, often we find groups are coming to us at very early stages when they haven't yet acquired a building. They've spotted something, a site that they're interested in, or see a vacant building in their area and want to do something with it, and it matches a plan that they have. But if you don't already own the building or have a lease on it, obviously what's really critical is what your prospects are for securing that. So fundamentally, if a project is going to be viable, you need to have a realistic prospect of either acquiring a freehold or negotiating a long lease. So as in the case of this project that's pictured here, this is the ex-Havens department store in Southend-on-Sea, had closed down, and Age Concern in Southend negotiated a long lease with the owner to turn it into a hub for older people. If you're looking at freehold, Then do you have an independent valuation for the building? That's something that we could help with. And can you raise the funds, or is the asset being transferred to you? And if it's on the open market, do you have the time, or in the case of if it's been designated an asset of community value, do you have a window in which you can raise the funds to buy that building? Or have you developed a relationship or a rapport with the owner who's very supportive of what your vision for that building is? So how realistic is it that you'll be able to get the freehold? If you're looking at taking on a lease, then how long will that lease be for? Like a number of funders, we look for a long lease. We're looking for a minimum of 25 years in order to feel that there's security there to invest in a building. But we also require that to be a full repairing and insuring lease. So you have responsibility for the maintenance, not just the internal space, but the external fabric and the insurance of that building. So even before we're in a position to support a project with a viability grant, we need to see that there's a realistic prospect that you'll be able to acquire the building. Condition. What condition is the building in? And again, in early stages, sometimes groups, organisations have not actually had the opportunity to even get into a building. But establishing what its defects are and whether it can be repaired and restored to meet your needs is a fundamental. So establishing that could involve an architect, particularly if they have conservation experience, or a surveyor to produce a building condition survey. So this is this photograph is of the old bank in Chipping Norton in Oxfordshire that we've supported with a viability grant and subsequently a development grant. They actually had plans to do quite a bit of structural work inside and demolishing some new extensions at the rear. So they involved a structural engineer at an early stage, at their viability stage, to establish whether that was going to be possible. So what those kind of repair and restoration costs would be, and looking very carefully at the condition of this Georgian building. So so being clear on the condition of the building and what you can do with it is an important foundation. And then the need and demand. So how do you envisage this building being used? And can you demonstrate that there is a need for that and a demand and support for what you're considering? So to test and evidence that, you're likely to need to do consultation. And that could be with the wider public or the specific community that you're targeting, and wider stakeholders. And then alongside that, market research. Is there anything similar? Can you prove that there is a case for what you're proposing to do? So this is a lovely belly dancing class actually that's happening in that ex-department store that I showed you earlier in Southend-on-Sea. Age Concern had been operating outside of out of another premises. They knew that they'd outgrown it. They knew that there was a demand there. They could show that they could do so much more with a bigger site. So adaptation, obviously the condition of the building is one thing, and what kind of repair needs it has. But in most cases, a building will need to be adapted in some way to accommodate the uses that you have in mind. So, so obviously with historic buildings, you can be creative and innovative with your designs, but you also need to be sensitive to the heritage of the building and not harm its significance. And certainly as the Architectural Heritage Fund, we are looking for a conservation-led approach to work being done to bring buildings back into use. So you are likely to need to work with an architect to help you draw up some concept designs, and maybe a structural engineer or a surveyor to look at the services as well. And at the very least, you're going to need an architect that's got experience of working with historic buildings, and ideally a conservation accredited architect, particularly if you're going to be looking for support from Historic England, who obviously place a lot of emphasis on that. This is Foresters Hall in Ramsgate, a community meeting hall that has now been acquired by East Kent Mencap to turn into a centre. So looking at how they could reuse that space and adapt that space was a critical part of their viability study. They're now on to into the development stage. So linked to that, obviously, and what your plans are to adapt the building is the likelihood of securing planning permission, and if the building is listed building consent for what you plan to do. So at the outset, you do need to do some research. It would be really helpful. So you need to know, is the building that you're interested in nationally or locally listed? Is it in a conservation area, described in the conservation area appraisal? Is there a local or neighbourhood plan? Basically, you're looking for anything that might restrict or impact on your plans to restore and adapt the building. So the more detailed development of plans obviously feed into that planning application, listed building consent application, but you need to know sort of as early as possible the prospect of being able to secure that and whether you're going to be able to go forward. Costs critically at the viability stage. You also do want, obviously, an indication, albeit a fairly ballpark, at an early stage for what it will cost you to restore and adapt the building. And that outline cost plan could come from your architect, but more often than not will involve a quantity surveyor who will look at both the condition of the building and your plans and come up with an outline cost plan for the capital works, the building works that are needed. And that's something that will become more accurate, be refined as you work through your project and your detailed design stage. As in the case of this building, this is the Wheatsheaf pub in High Wycombe, which again we've supported through viability development and is now at the capital building stage. And at each stage, that cost plan has been tightened. But even at viability, obviously they needed to have a very clear idea that what they were proposing to do was affordable and build a funding plan around that. I'll come on to that shortly. So business planning, this is another thing. Business plan is another thing which will start in outline form, but does need to be there. It can then evolve and become more accurate, more detailed as you progress. But it is important to show that there is an outline business case for the project. And that will pull in your market research and your consultation, so to show that there is a need and a demand. But you'll also need to consider upfront how much it's likely to cost to sustain the project, i.e. run the building and the activities that you're proposing to do within it, and then how you'll cover this. So, so starting to kind of scope out projected income and projected expenditure, ideally for at least 3 years post-completion. So this is the old library in Acton, a project also that we've recently supported that plans to become a cinema and a cafe on the ground floor, and then is proposing to lease the upper floor to a school, so it has a range of different income streams that will that will sustain the maintenance of that Grade 2 listed building. Environmental sustainability, have you considered the likely impact of climate change on your building and project? I mean, in this case, this is the ice house in Great Yarmouth on the river, and so at risk of flooding from rising water levels. And so looking at those environmental sustainable issues was really critical to establishing that this project was viable, and the organisation, it's an arts organisation taking over this building. I've been working with the Environment Agency to look at their plans for flood defences to assure them and their funders, us included, that it was viable to develop this building in this location. But it's also about factoring in repairs and adaptations that will future-proof the building. So things like insulation, heating systems, transportation, how people will get to your site. It's something that most funders, certainly us and the Heritage Funder, will look quite carefully at now in terms of being assured that the project is viable. I have those, climate change challenges been factored in. Governance. So do you have the right organisational structure to deliver your project? So for example, if you're a community interest company or a local authority, you won't necessarily be able to access the same range of funding that a charity can. Are you incorporated? So what risks are your trustees taking on in moving forward this project? Can you actually own or lease property? And do you need to consider whether you need a different or a new organisational structure to actually run the project once the building is complete? So this is a project we've just supported with a Viability grant. It's Princelet Street in Spitalfields, and it's being led by Assemble Studio, who are a CIC, but part of their plans, even at Viability stage, is to look into setting up a new CIO, charitable incorporated organisation that will actually run the building once it turns into a sort of community centre, which is the vision for it post completion. So sort of thinking about the governance, not just for the development and the delivery, but with the operation. Capacity and capability. Essentially, have you got the skills and the experience needed to develop and deliver this project, and have you got the time to do it? That can be a killer straight away. Who's going to lead this? These projects take years and a huge amount of energy and a passion. So it's a case of being realistic about how much you can do in-house and what expertise you might need to buy in. And obviously that's where our Viability grants can help. You might be able to do some of the business planning or community consultation yourself, but you're likely to need an architect, a quantity surveyor, a structural engineer, someone to help you, survey the services. This is the Alice Billings House in Stratford, project being led by the Creative Land Trust. They secured a Viability grant from us and have just appointed personnel to work with them to help do some concept design and establish viability for their plans for this building. So it's looking at how you build your team to be able to move it forward and being realistic about the skills that you need. A local context, really important to a lot of funders, us especially, because we are currently running a programme which is focused on our high streets and town centres. Then we will look quite carefully at the local strategic context. So that will have quite a bearing on your ability to secure funding and support. What's going on in your local area? You know, what are the wider regeneration plans, initiatives? What are the demographics? Deprivation data is something that we look at as a funder. You know, is your area in receipt of Future High Streets Fund or levelling up monies, towns deals? We know there are lots of different funds flying around at the moment and initiatives going on. This is Stanley Halls in South Norwood. It's within a High Street Heritage Action Zone. So, so they are working with Historic England, and that partnership is an important part of their planning and their prospects for realising the vision for this building as an arts venue. And then funding. Finally, I think I've got to the end of the rather long list of issues to consider. But of course, it's not viable if you can't fund it, which is why obviously all those stages need to be in place to have a clear idea of what it's likely to cost, and then being again realistic about what your prospects are of raising the money that you'll need to develop your plans further, actually deliver the capital works, and then run it. So, so you need a realistic sort of outline funding strategy at the viability stage. So, so where might you get funding from? Realistically, how much from those sources, and to what extent are you a good fit with that potential source of funding? So you know, ballpark, how much do you think you're going to be able to raise? How much confidence can we have? So in most cases, as you'll have seen, there is a lot to consider, but it is really vital to get the foundations right. It's so important to have considered all these range of issues if you want to be in a position to go on and deliver a successful heritage building project. And that's why AHF has a particular focus on supporting organisations to look at their viability. It's where a lot of our funding go, a lot of our grants go on viability and then subsequently development, working those plans up. So we provide, as I mentioned, advice and support before you get to the point of putting the application in. We'll always want to, if we can, have a conversation. Pre-COVID, we would visit as many projects as we could before they would submit their application. We provide quite detailed guidance on tackling viability, and a template report, which is quite helpful to kind of frame your approach to assessing the viability of your project, and then a grant of up to £15,000 that can help meet the costs of some of the work that will need to be done, particularly where you need to bring in some of that expertise to help you establish some of those, cover some of those areas. So, for example, assessment of the building's condition, working with an architect to look at some design solutions, working with a QS to get an indication of what the cost of repair and conversion might be, or getting some consultancy help to develop your business case, do your market testing and consultation, perhaps getting an independent valuation if you are looking at potentially securing freehold, or advice on the governance side of things in terms of how you're set up or how you might need to change your governance arrangements. We will provide up to 100% of the cost of the work, so there's no match fund needed, but it does obviously, you know, £15,000 can sound like quite a lot, but there is quite a lot of work to cover, so often people are needing to top that up from their own funds, or potentially go to another funder like Heritage Fund. But if you can do it within that envelope, you don't need to put any match funding up. And it's an open application process online. You can apply at any time. And we have monthly panels. So we make a decision fairly swiftly. Usually you get a decision within 6 to 8 weeks. And then you have a year to complete your viability work. During COVID, people have been taking longer than that, so it can be up to 18 months, but we'll support you as best we can through that process. And then I thought, just to wrap up, I'll just say a little bit about how we assess applications. I mean, this goes for all of the grants that we award, but including the viability grants. So obviously we need to check that your project is eligible and meets our criteria. And as I say, at the moment, our focus is on buildings on or near high streets in town centres. So that's an important criteria for us to look at the location of the building. But we're also looking at, as the Architectural Heritage Fund, obviously we're looking at the heritage need. So is the building listed? It doesn't need to be listed for us to support it, but obviously it helps make a strong case. Equally, if it's a building at risk or in a conservation area and it's a blight on the conservation area because it's vacant and clearly needs work. Social impact, really important. Who are the likely beneficiaries? We look at the local context. We'll look at deprivation indices and get a sense of what your project will achieve in its outcomes. Why now? So what's the urgency? Are there opportunities that are available to you now that might be lost? For example, other funding that needs to be drawn down or spent. So, because if we're oversubscribed, the projects that aren't demonstrating why they need to happen now may well be knocked down the list or deferred. And financial need, if you've got really healthy reserves, obviously it's harder for us to make a case for awarding a grant. And do you have other sources of funding potentially that could contribute to this or cover the costs? Sustainability, so that is about business case as well as the environmental sustainability, and you as an organisation. Do you have a track record? Does this align with your organisational objectives? Who are you? We will do that due diligence, look at your accounts, look at the Charity Commission, Companies House, etc. And all of these things feed into a case paper. Our trustees who make decisions on our grants don't see your application. They see a case paper that myself and my colleagues, programme officers, will put together. And so these are the kind of the key headings that we use in putting your proposal together and forward for decision. So that's just to give you a sense of how we do that. I'm sure that's about half an hour up, and it's a lot of information to absorb first thing on a Tuesday morning. So I'll leave it there. Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take any questions.